If we look at our hate crime data, for example, anti-Black hate crime is most frequent, followed by anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim, anti-gay. There's very few racialized or other minority communities that are not somehow affected by hate crime, and that has a dramatic effect not just on the individuals but on the communities as well.
Our next guest is the director at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. She has written extensively in the area of hate crime and right-wing extremism. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Barbara Perry for a few years, and she never ceases to amaze me with her knowledge. I'm so excited for you to listen in as we chat with this well-respected thought leader today. Welcome to the show, Barb. How you doing?
Good to see you, Victor.
You as well. So, for everyone that listens in, we always like to dive right in and we ask some of the tough questions, and we always go back to childhood because we feel like that's where we start to really learn about the world around us. So what was your childhood like growing up, and how much of that experience shapes the work that you do today?
That's a great question. It's probably maybe the third time I've been asked that in the last few years, and I always sort of am taken aback by it because I'm trying to figure out the answer to that question. I guess in retrospect, it was really an idyllic life. Life growing up. I was raised on a farm. My dad was a dairy farmer. I just grew up being in the outdoors and being outside and enjoying myself, which is very odd. I mean, I had no traumatic experiences or no difficulties. I breezed through school. I will be honest, I was a bully. And so maybe that's part of it. I actually had that conversation with somebody a few weeks ago that, for all of my relative privilege, farmers are never rich, and my dad certainly wasn't, but I never felt disadvantaged. But for all of that, I was the class bully until, probably 8th grade, 9th grade, or somewhere around there. So perhaps I'm doing atonement now and trying to make amends. And I remember a few years back, we had a class reunion of my grade school class. And some of the women that we had gone to school with, because there were a couple of us that were sort of leading the charge there, said, "Why would I want to see you people again? You treated me like shit, excuse me." But I was like, okay, yeah, you got me there. So maybe that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is really to overcome the way that I mistreated people as I was growing up.
I think that's really profound in the sense that, you are now talking specifically around people who, enact bullying in the forms of hate and extremism. So, back at grade 6, 7, 8, Dr. Barbara Perry, before she was doctor, was a bully. And I think that, for that, it really is showing you that people can change, which I love. Right. I think that's really impressive. Now, this, dairy farm and this school, was this in sort of like Greater Toronto area, or was this somewhere more rural where, it was a little bit different? You weren't exposed to maybe different cultures, etc., or was it pretty ethno-diverse?
Very rural, a couple hours east of Toronto. So yeah, very homogeneous. I think going through grade school, I think there was one Indigenous student who had actually been adopted by, a white family. And I think that was about it for diversity. Even high school, there was, again, I think, 3 Black students. Again, they were all adopted. So we didn't even have at that time, there weren't even Black families. Now, interestingly enough, we were on the edge of Tyendinaga Indigenous Reserve, east of Belleville. So, we did have exposure to Indigenous folks through softball in particular, not so much through school.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, bias is definitely something that affects us all. How do you see sort of biases shaping the reality of the world we live in today?
Oh my gosh, there are so many indicators there, and it runs from bias all the way up to extremism, hence the name of the center. I mean, bias is embedded in our culture from the get-go, from first contact, and the processes of colonization are that's in our psyche, our national psyche. So we continue to see the manifestations, the consequences of those historical processes. But obviously, we see it in institutional structures of racism, homophobia, misogyny. You name it. It's across the board in key institutions. There's not a core institution in our society that's not somehow affected by that. We see it in manifestations of hate speech and hateful narratives and hate crime, whether it's online or offline. And the social media has just been an incredible boon, if you will, for hate mongers. It really has allowed them to both disseminate their narratives and have their beliefs reinforced and reaffirmed by sort of isolating themselves in what we've come to call now echo chambers, so that they become even more hardened and more firm in their resolve to hate whoever that might be. So we see it in police data, police reported data on hate crime, where in 2017 we saw a 47% increase. In 2020 we saw a further 37% increase. So at historical highs in terms of police reported hate crime. We see it in extremism and the rise of the far right, which has trebled probably in the last 5 or 6 years since we published our first report in this area. Now in the update, so in 2015 we identified just over 100 active hate groups, and now far right hate groups specifically. And in the last couple of years, we've identified now more than 300 such groups. So any way you look at it, we're seeing a dramatic surge in hate, hostility, sort of extreme manifestations of bias, if you will.
So that's interesting, because would you say then, if I'm understanding correctly, that bias is sort of like the beginning point, and then you can get to further progressive levels that lead to the extremism that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the foundational building block. Stereotypes, negative attitudes, and if they stay at that level, right? If it stays at the level of attitudes and it's not expressed, well, we're not thought police. You can believe what you want. It's when, those biases then are reproduced or expressed and reproduced. And that's sort of when we're talking about the structural forms of racism. It's embedded in policy and practice and the way that we do business, or the way that, the law is enforced or enacted. So all of those sorts of pieces. There's the Anti-Defamation League in the U.S. years ago constructed, what has been now is taken as sort of the, I guess, most representative or most effective way to visualize this sort of exacerbation, if you will, with what they called the pyramid of hate. So at the bottom, we had, there's bias and, negative attitudes and those sorts of things. And the next stage up is, hate speech and derogatory jokes and slurs and all of that sort of thing. And each one builds. If left unchecked, each one builds on the other till we get to the point. Now, their final point was genocide. And, we hope that we don't get to that stage, but of course we've seen it even in recent years, and even historically. I mean, Trudeau famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, did describe our treatment of Indigenous peoples as genocidal. So perhaps we have had that experience, but certainly it sort of escalates throughout that pyramid.
So and you talked about the embedding of this within sort of society or within individuals as well. Is there a correlation between societal and individual bias, would you say?
Yeah, well, and of course, I think it's cyclical. But right now, of course, what we're seeing is the ways in which broader social patterns contribute to increased hostility, increased suspicion, increased fear, whatever it is that underlies these sorts of biases. So we've seen it in, obviously coming from the South in particular, we've seen it in political discourse and the vilification of particular communities and how that's impacted public opinion around those same sorts of communities. And, not to lay all the blame at the feet of Trump, because we've had our own fearmongers in the Canadian context. And so it has been reproduced in public opinion as well. And then, of course, as public opinion starts to lean in that direction, politicians in particular, and far-right groups exploit that. And so that's sort of where the cycle emerges, is that they mutually reinforce one another.
And would you say, because you mentioned something that I've personally seen, and I'm someone who typically tries to stay off of social media, but I've spent a little bit of time on LinkedIn in the last year, and I've noticed a sort of an uptick of people pushing very specific narratives, and is this sort of the outlet that people are choosing social media to really push those narratives and gain popularity amongst groups?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what we've seen, especially under COVID, for multiple reasons. The pragmatic reason is that, if we were under lockdown, even the bad actors were behaving themselves more or less. But on sort of either end of COVID, we've seen a lot of offline activity and offline sort of sharing narratives, especially in the last, around COVID, specifically around the last 6 months or so, especially, the protests, the anti-vax protests, the anti-lockdown protests. I mean, they've been longer lasting, but I guess maybe it's really the epitome of those, or the acme of those, were the protests at the hospitals during the last election campaign, the federal election campaign. So we do see some of that offline, but so much of it is online, because we're all at our computers, we're all on our phones, on our devices. 24/7, it seems like. I mean, I don't know when some people sleep. They're so busy, disseminating some of this nonsense. So it absolutely has become not just, and it's not just about sort of the production, but it's also about the consumption of those narratives, that, we're exposed to them. We're going looking for them. Again, in the context of COVID, there's so much emotional and psychological anxiety, financial anxiety. We're looking for answers. We're looking for scapegoats. And there are some, hate mongers that are very happy to give simple explanations for why we're in the situation we are, and exploiting conspiracy theories and exploiting stereotypes about particular communities. So, it's there for all of us to consume.
You mentioned something interesting about consumption, because, I mean, there's no lack of this out there, right? And I've noticed it specifically around COVID. I've noticed it with the BLM movement, like Black Lives Matter. I've noticed it with a few different things where people are consuming a lot of this a narrative. And how does that typically influence, if you could speak to this, the impressionable individuals that can, take something and run with it?
Yeah. Well, this is where the far right in particular have been, quite skilled in exploiting populist concerns and anxieties like COVID, or like job loss, or, business, the loss of businesses, mass loss of businesses we've seen in the last year or so, exploit those vulnerabilities, and really play to them and play them up. And so individuals who, as I said, are looking for those explanations, are ready to consume those conspiracy theories, and it builds on perhaps maybe sentiments that have been lying dormant or just below the surface amongst those individuals. So again, if we look at public opinion polls, we're seeing dramatic increases over the last 5, 6, 7 years around anti-immigrant sentiment, even around anti-Muslim sentiment. And when people are asked, is questions about their freedom to express those sentiments, they say, "Yeah, I do feel like it's more acceptable to express those negative attitudes." So they are, I think they're using those narratives, they're adopting those narratives to suit their own needs, and then reproducing them or retweeting them, not reproducing them, just passing them on, so that it spreads within their network. and then they come back, right, and reinforce it one another. So again, I'm talking a lot about cycles today, but that really is what we're seeing.
Wow. Now, earlier this year here in Canada, we were rocked by the discovery of the Indigenous residential schools and the remains there. We saw an increase in anti-Asian hate due to the pandemic. And in London, Ontario, we had a family that was killed for walking while Muslim. What effect does hate have on us as a society at large?
At root, it's divisive. The kinds of hateful narratives we've seen have polarized us. There's sort of no middle ground, right? Where we tend to take a position now and dig in our heels and stick with that position. I think that has been sort of one of the most dramatic and dangerous and harmful outcomes of COVID, for example, because it has been a context in which those manifestations of hatred have increased. And it makes it hard to walk that back now. It makes it hard to put that genie back in the bottle, so to speak. So this past half dozen years, because it predates COVID, in terms of the hate mongering and the growth in hate crimes and hate speech and hate groups, it is a long trajectory that we've been seeing. And the sad thing is I don't see it ending anytime soon as we continue with restrictions around COVID and the reactions to those restrictions. Trump's still very much in the picture, likely to run in the next election. Some pundits are saying he's likely to win the next U.S. election. How will that affect us? It affected us dramatically when the baseline was quite low. The baseline has risen. If he exacerbates that, Canadians and Americans both, I think, will see that escalation again.
Wow, and that's something that, like you said, has polarized us, many of us. And I've talked to folks in the U.S. who are friends and family members are polarized.
Yeah.
They've had to remove you. We were talking about social media earlier, remove them from social because the narratives that were being pushed. Yeah. Which is just the dissemination of that information throughout the network, right? So now, one of the things
let me just add. I sort of lost track of the question there for a minute, but I think the other consequence, one of many other consequences that we need to attend to is the fear that it's instilled, the anxiety it's instilled in the communities that are most affected by it. If we look at our hate crime data, for example, anti-Black hate crime is most frequent, followed by anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim, anti-gay. There's very few racialized or other minority communities that are not somehow affected by hate crime, and that has a dramatic effect not just on the individuals but on the communities as well. And that's a lot of what my work has been done. What a lot of my work has been about with communities is looking at what are those ripple effects, what are those carry-on effects for others. So it's not just the individual victim who becomes fearful and changes their way of being in the world. Muslim women perhaps taking off the veil, or Jewish men no longer wearing the kippah. Those sorts of things. So it changes not just how you feel but how you act as well. And people feel like they have to hide or suppress a part of their identity to be safe, and that's a horrific thing to force on anyone, any community, for them really to deny who they are.
And that's actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that segues perfectly to something I was going to ask, is the fact that, you are someone who is very well respected for your work in the anti-Semitism, Islamophobia space. So you understand religion a little bit more than the average person. And you mentioned about people, feeling like they needed to discard some of the religious garb that they would wear for the necessity to fit in. I noticed that growing up in Scarborough, which for our listeners who don't know is really a multicultural, diverse area. One of probably the most multiculturally diverse areas in Canada, with the amount of people from different regions and places in the world. And I remember specifically in and around that grade 7, grade 8, when kids can become those bullies, that a lot of the folks that were Muslim would start to remove their turban, remove their hijab, or the Sikhs would remove their turbans because of being made fun of when coming to school. Does that still, seem to be the case today? And how does that sort of work into the workplace and sort of higher academia, because you're teaching at the university? Like, what is the pulse, today versus 20 something years ago when I was noticing that?
Well, there's still some of that. There absolutely is. In interviews that I've done with folks from the Muslim community, from within the gay community as well, who say, I try to look less gay, whatever that means. So you do still see that, but you also see, interestingly, an awful lot of people who are also saying, they're sort of pushing back against that and saying, you're not going to silence me. I've had young Muslim women say, it was when they started to experience discrimination or became aware of it in their environs, that's when they actually started to put on the hijab, so that it was to take a stand, to sort of express themselves, to express their identity openly and say, no, you're not, I'm not having that. So it really can go in either direction. I'm more likely to hear, sadly, people who are sort of going back in the closet, so to speak, who are trying to hide their identity. But there are, I think, an encouraging number of people who resist that.
Do you think authenticity has a liability to it?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's why folks are, when we look at anti-Muslim violence, for example, it's women who are more likely to experience anti-Muslim hate crime than men. And in large part, it's because of their visibility. So, yeah, if they are, if they're living their authentic selves and expressing themselves as they would like to, and feel maybe that they need to, yeah, it does, sort of draw attention. It does provide, I won't say the impetus, but a signal, if you will, of their identity, a symbol of their identity, which does become a liability in that sort of environment where people are being singled out because of their group identity.
Yeah, there's one girl who was actually our first guest on the show. She had received a lot of hate. She was doing a lot of speaking about being Muslim and sort of her removal of the hijab, her thought process around some of the old ideologic and religious sort of constructs that have been taught versus her sort of finding her own way. And she received a lot of hate from folks who were like, you're not a true Muslim, you're this and that, like, and from all sort of parties, like, she was being called her words, I think it was Paki, or like just really difficult things to be reading. And it was all on social media, people who had never met this individual, and it was very hard for her as a human being. What can we do to sort of not have this hatred and not go after people? Like, what are your thoughts around that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. You ask the easy questions, don't you? Yeah. I mean, I think that we're looking for a silver bullet, and there isn't one. There are just so many strategies that we have to engage in simultaneously. I often talk of the need for multi-sectoral approaches. I mean, we tend to think about hate crime as a law enforcement issue, a criminal justice issue. It's not. That's sort of the last resort. It's a public health issue. It's an educational issue. It's a social service issue. I mean, all sectors of society, civil society in particular, have a role to play in challenging this. In fact, most of a lot of the really good work being done around counter narratives or challenging hate online in particular is coming from civil society organizations, community-based organizations, not necessarily from government entities. So I think that that is certainly one thing that needs to be done, is to support the work of those kinds of organizations to continue to do what they're already doing, and some programs having incredible effects in that respect. You're never going to catch those folks at the fringe, right? You're never going to catch the folks at the extreme. I mean, they're too far gone. You can't talk logic, you can't talk science, because they deny all of that. What I'm interested in is capturing that sort of mushy middle, who's maybe apathetic, who are maybe bystanders, and encouraging them to be upstanders, but also, giving them the tools, whether they're youth or adults, giving them the tools and the capacity to recognize disinformation, hate, whatever it is that is of concern when they see it, and developing ways and strategies of countering that, which can be either, simply, disengaging, or, if it's safe, to push back against it.
And if you could give us maybe one or two tools that you would recommend outside of sort of disengaging, is there anything that you would say that someone could do to help with the fabric of society? Because like you said, we all have a part to play.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that we've seen is, and I think this has something to do with exhaustion and fatigue, is we've seen a bit of a decrease in sort of engagement, public engagement in those kinds of community-based organizations I was talking about. And I think that's one thing, is that we can get involved, we can be a part of those organizations that are developing strategies. So it's that old call to volunteerism, but in a very specific space here. I think the other thing, and this is something I harp on a lot, is this whole idea of sort of, especially in this context, the current context, critical digital literacy. And that is, it's important to fact check and all of that sort of thing, but it goes deeper than that as well. And I think, again, it comes back to what I was talking about, those skills, that knowledge, that awareness, the capacity around how to counter those sorts of narratives as well. So it's taking a deep dive into those things that are passing our screen on a daily basis. Don't just simply tweet them on, retweet them, but take a moment. It's interesting. A year or so ago, I remember reading about someone who was building an application that you would, this is not something that the government would impose, but that you could, put on your own device or perhaps on your children's device. And when something, that was potentially disinformation came by your screen, or was maybe hate speech or something like that, it would be flagged, so that you would take a moment, reflect on it, think about it, and then decide, whether you wanted to share it, or whether you wanted to respond, or whether you wanted to dig more deeply into the issue, do your own research, that sort of thing. And I thought it seems like a very small thing, but anything that gives us pause and encourages us to reflect on what we're consuming, I think, is a step forward.
I love that. I think that, a lot of times that pause and reflection point gives us an opportunity to really determine whether or not this is information that we want to take in, whether that's information that we believe is valid, or we want to discard it. And I think that a lot of people just take things at face value versus really looking at how we could, sort of filter the information, if you will. And to that volunteerism point, I think that that's really interesting. People getting involved in this conversation. Are you finding that people are becoming more involved in this conversation post George Floyd?
Well, interesting. Yeah, I mean, we did have a very active summer last year, but things are a little quiet again. I mean, even after the exoneration, not exoneration, the finding of not guilty for Rittenhouse in the U.S., I expected an awful lot more activism. I think that people are becoming deflated in that context, in response to those sorts of incidents. So we did see, probably a year and a half, Black Lives Movement was very visible and vocal in the Canadian context, and we've had some, sort of Indigenous Lives Matter, and that's sort of paralleling that. Right now, we are seeing a lot of activism around the pipelines, but I feel like it's become muted again over the last, maybe since the summer. And again, is it exhaustion? Is it deflation? Is it, sort of loss of idealism? Because it has been a very, very difficult year for, a couple of years for all of us, but particularly for communities that are so frequently targets of hate, bias, and extremism.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the things that I think about is how much of that trauma can you actually take on before it consumes you, right? Because I think that when we look at and I'm also guilty of this myself, is if I look at sort of the things that are wrong, I find that my personal happiness deteriorates. But when I look at the things that are great and positive, they make me feel better. And I know that for, if I look at all the sort of microaggressions, the slights, the this, the that, the other, they start to add up, and it becomes really tiring. It's like dragging a weight. And how much of that trauma that folks have gone through intergenerationally maybe have spoken to the slowdown of this? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said there. When I first started working in this space, hate crime, one of the first communities I was working with were Native Americans in the U.S. And that's when I started to hear this, exactly the sort of thing you're expressing there, is that being weighed down consistently. And, that's the intent of, hate crime or hate speech. It is to silence people. It is to oppress them. And it's been very successful for far too many people who have been, rendered fearful, who have been terrorized by the potential. And it's not just the experience that is definitely, it has an impact, but the potential for those sorts of incidents also weighs on them. So it absolutely is, something that we talk all the time about how do we counter hate narratives? How do we counter hate crime? We don't talk enough, I think, about how do we also support those who are affected by it? What kinds of resources are available for them? And I think that that's an area where we've let communities down. We've left it to the communities themselves. So we've left it to, Muslim community organizations or Jewish or LGBTQ community organizations to support themselves. But what can we do as allies to support all of those who are affected?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we're always conscious of at Discourse, because, as we try to help these communities, it's about building resilience in our own personal selves, right? Because I think that to get rid of societal constructs, that's a very long picture, one that, has predated us and will probably post-date us as well. But, in terms of the day-to-day, how do we really help to bolster individuals' ability to feel like they actually are welcomed and belonged in this community that we call our area, our own space, whether that be the work, whether it be the place that we live or where we play. And I know that that's where we sort of met when we did a lot of work within the region that we all live in, and the police service and things of that nature. Now, this center has been something for you that has been a dream for many years. Why is that?
Well, I think I'll reflect on a letter that a colleague wrote for me. I can't remember now. Maybe it was when I was being promoted to full professor. That was probably, I don't know. I needed a letter of reference from a colleague anyway. And when I read the letter, it was like, wow, because he said she was the first to A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that's even more the case in the Canadian context, because there are so few people working in this space of hate studies that I felt like the center was something that could really draw attention to these issues and shine a light on them. It could become, and I think you've heard me talk about, the sort of the three pillars, and I've added a fourth pillar to the work that we do at the center. One is the research. So it has absolutely become a phenomenal outlet for research on all of these elements. So we've supported that. But then we put that research to work. So there's the research, then there's the education and the public awareness. We do so much in that space in terms of mobilizing that knowledge, mobilizing that research for community-based organizations, for stakeholders across the board. We also work with community partners to develop programs and strategies to counter the issues that we've identified. And the fourth pillar is to work with policymakers and to work with government agencies to build out, sort of macro level strategies, if you will, to counter these issues as well. So we do a lot of consulting with those kinds of partners too. And so that was my dream. That was my goal for a center, was not just to create the research, but also to use it to make a difference in the community around us, locally, nationally and globally as well. And we're well on our way, I think, to doing that, given the sort of the visibility of the center and the extent to which we're called upon for the sharing of that knowledge and expertise.
Absolutely. And, like I said in the beginning, you're someone that I've always respected. You've been at a lot of the tables that I've been at in terms of the work that we've done collaboratively. And I know that you know Keith Richards very well, who is a huge advocate for this very same work. And that's really what we're aiming to do. I think, as we connect with people who are trying to advance humanity, and really better sort of the place that we live in. I know this sounds very cliche, but to leave the world maybe a little bit better off than when we got here, it really makes a difference for us because we live here, but also those who are behind us, right? And I think that is beneficial to society at large. Now, what is the goal for, like, if you were to say, I'm going to cast the vision for this center, what does that look like for you in the next 5 or 10 years? What do you really see being the hope?
Well, if I'm going to be very Pollyannish, I'll say, we'll work our way out of a job, and we'll fix the problems, and we won't have to. The center will be irrelevant. That's not going to happen. But I would like to think that we are visible enough, and that we are sort of connected enough, if you will, that we really can influence public policy, and through trickle down, also influence, I think, public dialogue and public discourse more broadly as well. So that we can work with our community partners to, develop the sorts of strategies which will become, sort of the gold standard, if you will, for challenging hate where we see it online and offline as well.
Excellent. Now, we asked this question to every one of our guests. I'm really looking forward to your answer. How do you think as a society we can move closer to a culture of belonging and respect?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I just keep thinking back to Rodney King, right? Can't we all just get along? And again, very Pollyannish, but that is our goal. And I think that so one of the things that we've been speaking about at this is that the regional level? No, I think in our city here is a series of public dialogues around what I've been calling civil words and civil deeds. I don't think that's the title they're using, but that's the title I like: civil words and civil deeds. And I think we just need to find a way to remind ourselves individually and collectively that everyone, sort of all boats rise in with the tide, if we can all remember to treat others, with that kind of civility, and to think twice about the language that we use, and I think to think twice about the actions that we take as well, in terms of those damaging and dangerous speech acts and other kinds of gestures and actions.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for that. Where can people find you if they want to look you up?
Through the center, because of the work that I do, I don't like to specify much more than that. But you can absolutely find our center. There are long ways to find it and short ways. You can Google Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, and it comes up. Or OntarioTechU.ca/CHBE.
Awesome. And thank you so much for joining us today. You've been a wonderful expert opinion on your view on extremism, hate, bias. We really appreciate you joining us today. And there you have it, folks. The truth according to Dr. Barbara Perry. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Victor.
Thank you so much for listening. Our show is sponsored by Discourse. We build belonging into the DNA of DEI. You can visit us on the web at discourseagency.com or check out our YouTube channel, Discourse Agency. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a review, drop a comment, and most importantly, share it with a fellow human. Thank you so much for your support. And remember, your truth is your experience. Bye for now.